Hello everyone, welcome back to another rambling video on the way to work. So today I wanted to share my thoughts about the narratives, both the narratives of Russia, or let's call it the Russian bloc, and the narrative of the Ukrainian Western bloc concerning the war in Ukraine. Or if you think about it, from the Russian perspective, the war actually is taking place in Russia. Because remember that Russia annexed these four oblasts, the Lugansk, Donetsk, Zaporozhye and Kherson. But some of these regions are not completely annexed. Part of them are occupied by the Ukrainians. It's just a point of view. Don't take it too seriously, but I mean, if you do share the point of view of the Russians, this is factual. So most of the war takes place in these oblasts. But the big question here is, after all this, after over 2 years of conflict, now finally Russia declared a state of war after the terrorist attack on the Crocus City Hall. And what do we expect to change, and who is winning? The main question is, after all, who is winning the war? Let's go first through most of the Ukrainian pro-Ukrainian outlets, news outlets. You know, the mouthpieces of the American Secret Services, like the New York Times and and the British, The Guardian, Sky News and CNN and whatever. You know, this main Western, and of course a lot of you can never forget there is like a pyramid, hierarchical pyramid in the communication sphere. You have the big channels, MSNBC, you name it, the big ones, and then you have an army of YouTubers, bloggers, podcasters, you name it, for all tastes. But you have them on both sides. I would say that they were not even in the beginning in terms of the information war, but definitely the Russians have been gaining a lot of ground, especially after the war in Gaza, that the people could see the double standards more clearly. But who is winning? You can also write on the comments, who do you think is winning the war in Ukraine? The Ukrainian bloc has been claiming all the time. This last few days has been a little bit different, but they've been claiming the past few years that Ukraine is definitely to win. They are going to win. They just need Western support to keep flowing. Victory is theirs. And when you ask them to explain how do they assess this information, how do they come to this conclusion, the answer, the Russians have retreated from a significant percentage of the territory they occupied in the initial stage of the offensive. They were kicked out of Kiev, they were kicked out of Kharkov, they were kicked out of Kherson. These are words of the Western bloc, right? They're not my words. This is their version. And since then, comparing the size and the power of the two countries, Russia has achieved very little. even though it has greater firepower and greater everything, greater manpower. And then they also claim that Russia, despite having all these advantages, air superiority, anti-air superiority, artillery superiority, you name it, they claim that Russia has a third-grade army, second-rate, whatever, low-quality army. All their people are demoralized. They just want to run away to their moms or whatever. They don't want to fight. They don't want to be there. This kind of argument, it's still going on. I mean, you just listen to, for example, General Ben Hodges, retired General Ben Hodges. I mean, he keeps saying that the Russians already lost and that the Ukrainians just need that extra push from the West, that extra aid, and they can turn it around. Even now, when even the same Western sources admit that the lines are faltering, that the Ukrainians, today I saw a news report saying that they don't know how much longer the Ukrainians can hold the lines. I made a video. Remember, I made a video not long ago talking about this. It's not Ukrainians that are lacking. It's the Russians that are stronger. And I still maintain this opinion. Of course, opinions can change, according to facts on the ground. But I still maintain this opinion. I think the Western help, they are giving the excuse, passing the narrative that because of this 60 billions that are not approved in the US, Ukraine now is feeling the lack of the 60 billions. And this is actually, it's utter bullshit. But the funny thing is that both Americans and Russians, both Westerners and Russians, go along with this narrative for two different reasons, of course. The Americans don't want to admit that they cannot really help that much more. I mean, they're already doing pretty much a lot. They are already doing, the Americans and the British, so they prefer to say that this is due to internal politics because we are a democracy, we cannot just decide and blah blah blah. So it's good for them because they pretend that they are a democracy, and it's good for the Russians, but for different reasons. Is that they are passing a narrative that demoralizes the enemy and also increases the moral of their own people, of their own bloc, the supporters of and the fighters in this conflict. So this is my assessment on that. But truth of the matter is that Ukraine does incursions, wastes perfectly well-trained soldiers, mercenaries, well-equipped. On the front line, they do incursions into Russian territory. They do massive drone and missile attacks into Crimea, and I keep saying, and they still hold the lines. I mean, they parry a lot of punches from the Russian side. It's not like it's crumbling. I mean, and of course now there are talks of the greatest Russian counter-offensive or Russian offensive, whatever you want to call it. I mean, the Russians have been improving their tactics. They have been improving their doctrine on the ground. I mean, it's really you can notice the changes. They have been adapting very well, for example, to the use of the new weapons. They are technologically ahead of the West in some of these weapons, and they are a sovereign country, so they actually can manage their economy and adapt it better to the conditions of the war and to the demandings of the war. For example, They have a military-industrial complex that is much more efficient than the Western one, which is hugely expensive. Just bear in mind this number. The Russians spend 10 times less in absolute figures than the United States in defense budget. And they do a lot more. So they are much more efficient with their defense budget than the Americans. Of course, you have to bear in mind also that the Americans, their defense budget, it's not going only to Ukraine, it's going to the empire. They have hundreds, 600 or 800 bases around the world that it costs. It's a lot of maintenance costs, running costs to have that. So that's why these numbers are also big. But on the other hand, I mean, their industrial complex is a money sucker. They just produce this top of the, I don't know, this cutting edge equipment, which are very, very expensive and take a lot of time to develop. And so yeah. And of course, it's private companies preying on the government, so they present their price as well. They stuff their packages well to sell to the government. And so yeah, but who is winning? The West claims that Ukraine has managed to hold the Russians, to bring the war almost to a standstill. I mean, they claim this for a long time. They are not claiming it that much anymore. Although a lot of news outlets, if you open, for example, Google News, a lot of news outlets still claim this. That they're always presenting this news that Ukrainians destroyed X, Y tanks, or they destroyed X, Y pieces of artillery. They captured soldiers. They killed. They're always giving in the news a lot of small facts about destruction of the Russian army, but overall they start saying that Ukraine cannot hold much longer. So yeah. But still, if you ask any European leader, they will say Ukraine till the last Ukrainian, and victory to Ukraine, and we will support them. Endless support to Ukraine. On the other hand, on the Russian bloc, I mean, the Russians have captured about 18 to 20% of the Ukrainian territory. They hold it. They did leave some parts. The Ukrainians like to claim that they were kicked out, but we know that the story is not exactly like this, right? We know it. Only the ones that see the war like a football match don't like to admit that. But you have to admit, even if you are pro-Russian, you have to admit Russian losses. And if you are pro-Ukrainian, you have to admit that this was not like that. For example, in the case of the retreat from Kiev. Although I think the positions the Russians had there were not easy to maintain. They didn't have a long logistical line, but Russia was just not prepared for war. I mean, barely 200,000 contingent for a country the size of Ukraine. They were just using the military to aid in their political goal, which was supposed to be a short one. It failed, as we all know. But they retreated from Kiev after the first negotiations. Never forget this. And then you had the Kharkov retreat. That was a bit of a mess, and one must admit that was not pretty. I mean, the Russians had barely an army, if one could call that, had barely people defending that huge line, and the Ukrainians took advantage, and very well taken, I must say. They did their Schwerpunkt, and they just advanced through there. Eventually the Russians were able to stabilize the lines, as we all know. They made it till Kupiansk, But the Russians are cracking the hardest nuts for example, in the Donetsk region, like the fall of Avdiivka and the fall of Marinka and the fall of Bakhmut or Artyomovsk. So I do think the Russians, they managed to hold solidly this territory. So I don't think the war is a stalemate. I think the Russians are going to cling to those territories. They're already administered by the Russian Federation. I have been to Donbass personally, and so I felt the feeling that of course you have some pro-Ukrainians, you have all kinds of people in everywhere, but the general sentiment in Donetsk city, for example, is that it's unconceivable for them the return of the Ukrainian government to administer, at least the Ukrainian government that there is in place, puppet of the Americans and of the Western Bloc. So I pretty much would say that both sides claim victory for different reasons. But I don't know about you, but I think Russia has got this one. I mean, 18 to 20% of the Ukrainian territory, and right now they are giving very strong signs that they are increasing the pressure, because when they started this offensive that captured Avdiivka, for example, it was said that they would exhaust their offensive capacity. Like, for example, in Bakhmut, you remember after Bakhmut, Artyomovsk, they stopped. But they're not stopping now. I mean, you have slowing down and then again, and slowing down and then again. But too many signs are given that they are not stopping, and they are going to continue. And if things continue like this on the Ukrainian side, they will break militarily. If they will not break internally, they will break on the front line. This is how I read it. Although, never forget that both sides make propaganda, both sides exaggerate their results and their achievements. If you ask me if Russia has any right to have done this war, going to the beginning of all this mess, I think you can make a very strong argument that already people that are much more knowledgeable than me to make it. For example, like John Mearsheimer or Jeffrey Sachs, to name a few, Pepe Escobar. And we are not talking about, when we talk about John Mearsheimer or Jeffrey Sachs, we're not talking about Russian insiders, like people paid by the Kremlin. It's absurd if you try to make that claim. So there are Western analysis, and even the mainstream one starts to recognize the Russian superiority will prevail. Remember that the Ukrainians are having a lot of difficulty, something that they accuse Russians of. They're having a lot of difficulty in having new recruits, in replenishing their ranks. They have a huge army. This is not to be taken like, oh yeah, now they're done. They're putting kids, for example, the Russian block of information propaganda, they are now putting a lot of videos of buses full of teenagers, not very young teenagers, but I mean, by judging by their faces, they're about 17-year-old. Some might be 16, some might be 19. They are not exactly teenagers, but very young people on buses and giving them training, and dispatching them to the front lines. Yeah, but that's an indication of lack of manpower. But like I said, it's not to take for granted that it's done. Ukraine has a huge army. Ukraine has a huge pool of mercenaries. Ukraine has Western troops on their soil doing a lot of jobs that they cannot do, and this helps a lot, and this gives a huge boost to the Ukrainian army. If the Ukrainians were fighting like a sovereign country on their own, they would have been wiped long ago. I have no doubt about that. I saw their performance back in 2014-15 against the militias of the Donbass. Of course, these militias were supported and trained by the Russians, but they were doing the bulk of the fighting, and they defeated their ex-compatriots. So you tell me, who is winning? I don't mean to say that things are easy for the Russians. They've never been. Russians are suffering a lot on the front lines as well. Everyone who's fighting on those front lines is suffering a lot. I have met veterans from the Russian side, ex-Ukrainians, that consider themselves to be Russians. I did find a sentiment of some anger and some anger towards the Russian management concerning the Minsk agreements, because they all agreed. I remember having dinner with a group of veterans, and they were all agreeing. There was a unanimous idea that Russia should have gone all the way to Kiev in 2015, and the SMO should have started back then and not now. It was too late. So, and also here you have evidence that Russia does not want to conquer Europe or anything like that. They could have done it before. If they wanted to annex Ukraine or to conquer Ukraine, they could have done it long before. It's a very stupid idea to think like that, like Russia is a kind of Germany in 1939. It's very basic thinking. And one that engages and believes in this narrative simply doesn't know the history. And it doesn't have to go too deep into it to know. So yeah, I feel that I'm rambling too much again. Sorry about that. By the way, if you, press the like and leave some kind of comment, even if it is to insult me. I really don't mind. I'm sorry, I can't take YouTubing that seriously. Otherwise I wouldn't have to go to this job all around the clock. But yeah, don't forget to press the like, subscribe, recommend the channel to some people if you really want to bore someone, or if you really want to prank someone, to make a prank on someone, and just recommend them my channel. I think it'd be a good way to leave someone unhappy. So yeah, so you let me know who's winning. One last thought. The narrative which is accepted by both Russians and Ukraine, of the lack of support by the West to Ukrainians, will only serve one purpose: escalation by the Western side. That's it. That's the sole purpose of it. You have descriptions of people on the front lines, people who is fighting there. And when Ukrainians do attack or do repel attacks, they don't notice any lack of shells. The Russians don't notice any lack of shells, any lack of drones, for example. They do massive drone attacks. They inflict big losses on the Russians when these are on the attack. They publish the videos. It's the proof are out there. So the Russians, despite all this, are advancing. It's because they are getting bigger, not the Ukrainians getting weaker. The Russians are not just advancing and Ukrainians. You have a lot of Ukrainians surrendering, but the lines maintain their cohesion. I challenge you to challenge me about this narrative. Okay. See you on the next one.